And now I'm very pleased to introduce our keynote speaker to officially kick us off, Dr. Natasha Ludwig. Natasha is a clinical neuropsychologist who specializes in neurogenetic disorders at Kennedy Krieger Institute, which is part of Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. So I'm not going to spoil Natasha's talk by telling you any more of her biography, but I will say that meeting Natasha almost exactly a year ago, I looked, it was July of last year, has been a tremendous catalyst for the R Foundation. She has helped us make several key connections over the last 12 months to a consortia of patient advocacy groups representing rare neurodevelopmental disorders that are helping to pool resources to address common symptoms and research needs. One of these connections is Combined Brain, which is an organization that's providing us with stellar scientific advising as we develop our research roadmap. And the session that we had yesterday was absolutely incredible, and can't wait to share more about that with everybody. So, Natasha, thank you.
So I just wanted to say I am so honored to be here today speaking in front of all of you and getting the chance to meet you and talk about kind of our shared experiences and working together. This is, I can quite honestly say, one of the biggest honors of my life to be here at this conference. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you to the R for all you've done to put this together. Amanda, this conference has gone like seamlessly, and I'm just so impressed. So thank you for all you have done. And to the rest of the board and others who contributed, thank you so much. So today I'm going to talk about behavioral phenotyping in rare neurogenetic disorders, preparing for clinical trials in ASXL. So my agenda for today, I want to start off by telling you all a little bit about my story and how this all started and how I got here. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about neuropsychology. That's my discipline. That's what I do every day as a clinician and a researcher. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how neuropsychology relates to behavioral phenotyping, which is really important for clinical trials. And then we're going to talk a little bit about barriers and solutions to measurement, which is part of behavioral phenotyping. So we'll go through all these vocabulary terms throughout the presentation, don't worry. So the day my little brother Gianni was born was the best day of my life. Although he crashed my 5th birthday party with his early arrival, I quickly forgave him when I realized I was finally a big sister. Gianni immediately became my best friend, and I was really proud of him. So proud, I dubbed him King of the Babies. And as you can see here in the middle picture, his hair was really spiky. So whenever I would draw a picture of him, he would be a little baby at the bottom, and then I would draw like his hair like this, like off the page. So my mom has like 100 drawings of this like baby with spiky hair. So yeah, I was really proud of him. I was just really excited to be a big sister. And I remember when he learned how to talk, he started to say words like, you know, mom, dad, dog. And I was so proud that I remember going in the grocery store and just being like to any stranger, like, my brother can say dog, like, Johnny, say dog, like, and then he would do it and I'd be like, see, and like just be super proud. So that was just, it was just so fun being a big sister. But then when Gianni was around 2 years old, he stopped saying dog, and he stopped speaking altogether. My parents took him through many, diagnostic evaluations, and a few years later, when he was about 4, he was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. And I remember being it was in 1995, so I was about 9 at the time, and them coming home from the appointment and saying, well, the doctor said he may never talk again. And that being really confusing and devastating to me. And so I remember taking him in that moment, and I was like, don't you worry, Gianni, we're going to get you to talk again. It's going to be okay, and really pumping him up and trying to be that supportive big sister. But it was really that moment, I think, it was so pivotal for me because that really brought me to my career in neuropsychology. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about his journey kind of over the years. He had a lot of therapies. He had a home ABA program that my mom developed for him. She hired local students that were at the college trying to become teachers, right? And they were, wanting experiences with learning, teaching children, right? And so she hired them and got an ABA consultant, and that was out of our home. And it was so interesting. I remember, he had really no functional play skills when this started. And I remember going to school one day, and they were training the teachers that were going to help him do the ABA with him. And coming home from school that day, he was able to do a 4-piece like fruit puzzle. And I was just like, wait, what? Like, how did that happen? He learned so much in that one day. And I'm like, this is really something, this ABA thing. And so that really like inspired me to like, I would crash in on his ABA sessions all the time and watch what they were doing, and just trying to learn, how to best interact with him and teach him. My parents are literally, I don't think they're human, I think they're superheroes. They did so much for him in terms of advocacy and getting him exactly what he needed through the school, and IEP meetings and therapies and such. He had limited language, so he lost his language skills, right? But then around age 7, he started to vocalize again and gained back some language. But that's always been a real big struggle for him, as well as severe behavior. So lots of, aggression and self-injury over the years. The funny thing about Gianni and my family is that my mom and stepdad are this tall, and Gianni is now this tall. So he's a big guy. And so when he became a teenager, when he was little, it was easy to manage the behavior, right? But then when he got older and became, an adolescent, his quality of life was really reduced because the behaviors were so difficult that, we couldn't bring him out many places. And his life was really restricted. And so my parents, did a lot of research and made the decision to, they found a residential school placement for him that was just the right fit for him. And he had a beautiful time there. It was absolutely amazing. The problem was it was 3 hours away from our home. And so my parents, I said they're superheroes, every single weekend drove 3 hours there and back to visit him, to spend the weekend with him from when he was 14 through 22. So over the years, lots of different medications, side effects, those sorts of things. So this is the tough stuff, right? But then, there was a lot of amazing things too about being his big sister. So Gianni learned to talk again, like I mentioned. He has a lot of single words now that he can communicate. It's hard to understand him, but his loved ones, those around him can understand, and it's really great that he has that functional communication. He's water loving. Oh my gosh, ever since he was little, loved water. Everything about water to this day, just playing in water, taking baths, going to the beach, just amazing. He has an amazing sense of direction. If you're ever lost, you don't need a GPS. He can take you back to where you came from. Ever since he went to his residential placement, they dubbed him the mayor. So he went from king of the babies to mayor. He has always got a huge big smile on his face, lots of laughs. He loves fist bumps. That is his restricted interest, is fist bumps. Everybody is fist bumping all the time. But it just brings, a smile to any stranger's face. Over the years, I got to see him build a lot of independence, and the community of support that rallied around him was absolutely amazing. Him and my family. And just seeing resilience in him, my parents, and those around me has really inspired who I am today and the values that I have. So his journey, being his big sister, I wanted to get involved, right? And so I always was interested in neuroscience. I went to college, Union College, a small liberal arts school, and majored in neuroscience there. Figured out I wanted to be a neuropsychologist. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, what that means in a minute. So then after college, I did a research position where I went to the Seaver Autism Center at Mount Sinai, and they specialize in rare neurogenetic diseases, specifically developmental disabilities. And so this is where I fell in love with this world of rare disease, and thought about how my role as a neuropsychologist could fit within this realm. So I went off to grad school, Georgia State University, and got a degree PhD in clinical neuropsychology, and ended up doing my internship and fellowship at Kennedy Krieger Institute, Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, where I am now as a faculty member. I started in 2019 as a faculty member, and the work that I do is primarily serving children from a clinical perspective with rare neurogenetic diseases, and then also doing research as well in this realm. Because of my work at Kennedy Krieger and being in a neurogenetics clinic, I finally talked to my parents about, hey, he has all the signs of having a rare neurogenetic condition. I think we should probably get him some genetic testing. And so they agreed. And so we went to Columbia, and he had whole exome sequencing, and the result came back literally a year ago, so July 2nd of last year, that he has a mutation in ASXL3, Bainbridge-Rober syndrome. So we got an answer. So that was a really emotional day to think about, diagnosis days, right? 26 years before we got that diagnosis of autism. And now we have this genetic etiology for that. And so immediately I was like, all right, what do we know about this, right? Consulted Google and found the R. And immediately emailed Amanda. What's going on? How can I help? What can I do? I do neuropsychology. I wonder if there's something I can help with, right? And so that's why I'm here today. And it's been amazing over the past year, connecting with everybody at the R and working with you all. So, quick update about how it's going. So here's my brother Gianni. He's 30 years old today. So the picture on the right is actually, we're celebrating his 30th birthday at Walt Disney. He had never been before, and it was amazing. He loves pirates. That's his other restricted interest. And so we went on Pirates of the Caribbean, and he was just so excited. And then on the right, left here is my wedding day in 2019, and he was my man of honor, and we had a brother-sister dance. It was just an amazing day. So he's doing really well. He's a happy guy. He has a nice residential placement right near my parents, so he gets to go home, swim in our pool all the time, and also has some independence too. There are days where a lot of times actually, he's like, I want to go back home, like home, back to my house. I had enough of you parents, So it's a really nice fit. Of course, we still struggle with behavior at times. Like, my parents were supposed to come to this conference, but he had a little bit of uptick in some severe behavior, and so they had to stay home and make sure that they were there to support him. So, that piece is still an ongoing struggle, but overall, he's doing really well. All right. So now I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about my current work as a neuropsychologist at Kennedy. So as I mentioned, I'm both a clinician and a researcher, and I focus on children with rare neurodevelopmental disorders, so I abbreviate that as RNDDs throughout this presentation. RNDDs are neurological conditions caused by a genetic difference, like the ASXL conditions. These are often associated with medical complexity and severe motor, sensory, and language impairment. So what is neuropsychology, right? So neuropsychology is the study of brain and behavior relationships. So thinking about how a person is behaving in the world and how that might relate to their brain development. And so when I see a patient, I'm assessing skills like communication, motor skills, attention, memory and learning, emotional regulation, reasoning, behavioral regulation, visual processing, right? And then also the biggest one here is adaptive functioning. So how are they functioning in the world around them? How are they getting their needs met, right? That is so important. And so, the reasons why a child might come see me is to really get a baseline assessment of how they're functioning, right? And then also to monitor their development over time. I'm able to provide feedback to their medical providers about what I'm seeing, and then they consider that within the context of their medical, history. But then also, I get to then make recommendations for therapies and for school interventions, things like that. Also, I can monitor response to intervention. If a doctor's trying a new medication that they think might have impact to cognition or communication or motor skills, I can help with that, right? So I do an assessment before the medication and then after the evaluation, and then we do our best to weigh in together and work together as a medical team to figure out, is this working or is this not working? And then also, if there's concerns by the family or the doctor for a regression or a plateau in skill development, we can take a look at that as well. And so I do a lot of serial assessments with kids over time. Common referral sources are neurologists, geneticists, epileptologists, therapists, and also parents too. All right, so what is a neuropsychological evaluation? What does it all entail, right? So it includes a record review, so thinking about the child's medical history and the medical context, and that also includes a literature review. What do we know about this condition that they have, right? Informant interview, so getting information from the parents about how the child's functioning, questionnaires. I do testing with the patient, right? So like different measures of intellectual functioning, motor functioning, everything I talked about earlier that comprises kind of the discipline of neuropsychology. And then I also just observe the child too. I play with them, I see how they're communicating with me, and then I put it all together, right? But I think the big piece, and then I talk to families about, making recommendations for home and school. But I think the big piece here is really the genetic context. So in the sense of when I see a child with a rare neurogenetic condition, I have to place all of this within the context of their medical history, right? So what is their genetic condition? What do we know about their genetic condition? And how does that relate to how this child's presenting? And what can that tell us, right? But for ASXLs, how do we understand the genetic context, right? So like, I need help. As a provider, I need to know, like, what can I expect, right? And so one of the big ways that we can get at that question is through natural history studies, right? So how a disease impacts a person over the life course. It doesn't require just one point of participation, right? It requires multiple points. And I know many of you here participate in different studies through different registries, where you're getting asked a lot of questions, right, about your child and multiple times over the course of their development. This is really important for getting us ready for clinical trials, but also for current clinical care, so that I can go to the research, right, and look, what can I expect for a child with an ASXL condition? And how does that relate to what I'm seeing in my office today? All right, so natural history studies are really important to be happening. This is according to the FDA. It's really important for that these happen very early in disease discovery, even before novel drugs are identified. And it's important because it helps to inform treatment targets that are most meaningful to patients and their families. But it's also important for care right now, right? So that people like me, clinicians like me, can go to the literature and see, okay, what can I expect for this child with this rare disease? All right, so let's talk a little bit about behavioral phenotyping, which is one aspect of a natural history study. So I put up some definitions here. So the definition of behavioral phenotype in a human is really the characteristic cognitive, functional, behavioral, and psychiatric pattern that's typical in that disorder. And then behavioral phenotyping is really just the collection of that information about the behavioral phenotype, right? So neuropsychological measurement is one aspect of behavioral phenotyping, right? So earlier I was telling you all about what neuropsychology is, what we measure. So it is really behavioral phenotyping in a way. So this is a little schematic I developed just to kind of help illustrate some points and how these kind of terms relate to one another. So a clinical neuropsychological evaluation, that's what I do, right? In order to do that well, I need natural history study. I need research on like what I can expect across the life course in these patients. But to do a natural history study, one component of that is behavioral phenotyping, right? And to do good behavioral phenotyping, we need good measures. So those neuropsych measures I described earlier, we need good ones. And there are a lot of barriers to this. Right now in our field, we have very limited good measures for individuals who are functioning in the realm of intellectual disability. So that's a lot of these kids with our ASXL conditions, right? And so that's a huge barrier to moving forward, behavioral phenotyping and natural history work. So the types of behavioral measures needed for clinical trial readiness are measures that can document development and the symptoms of the disorder, right? So document the natural history, and then also behavioral outcome measures. So measures that are really good at documenting response to treatment and changes in response to a new drug or a behavioral intervention, right? So we need both of those things. And it's ideal if those measures if the same measure can do both things, right? And so that's what we need to be focusing on. So again, this is really important for clinical trial readiness, but again, right now, to help me be a good neuropsychologist, right? All right, I'm briefly going to talk about some of the measurement limitations right now in rare neurodevelopmental disorders. So many of the measures that we have require a standardized administration. So you have to do exactly what the manual says in terms of how to present the task, right? And no support or substitutions. And so there's little room for accommodation, which is really not great because we know that kids with rare neurodevelopmental disorders often have common, severe motor impairments, sensory sensitivity, so visual and hearing difficulties. They might have difficulties with communication. A lot of our kids with ASXL conditions, right? The communication barrier, they might not be able to share their response with me verbally. So we have to get around that, right? And so we need measures that can be flexible to meet the needs of our rare neurodevelopmental populations. Also, there's the concept of floor effects. So tests are too hard for this group of kids. So a lot of kids are receiving like very low scores or scores of 0. And that's not very helpful for trying to understand, because even kids who have intellectual disability have a range of skills, right? They have strengths and weaknesses. We all do, right? And so we need to do better at developing measures that can capture that variability. And that's really important so we can understand a child's strengths and weaknesses to inform interventions, but then also for thinking about outcome measures, right? We need the needle to move in response to an intervention. And so measures need to be set up to do that well for us. Otherwise, the clinical trials may fail if we don't have the right measurements in place. We also must give, right now, we often give tests out of age range to accommodate for developmental level. So when I see a child with a rare neurodevelopmental condition who's developmentally functioning in the first or second year of life, there's very minimal measures that are appropriate for a child who is that age at that developmental level. So I'm often giving tests that are meant for 1 to 3 or birth to 3-year-olds in a child who's 18. you can see the problems with that, right? Like those children are very different. An 18-year-old with kind of cognitive functioning in the first 3 years of life is very different than a child in the first 3 years of life. And they may have splinter skills or uneven skill development. So our tests really need to be able to do a good job at managing that. And that's a psychometric problem, like a statistical problem with our tests. And then most scales, are developed to indicate whether a child is impaired or not, but not to really give us really nice, detailed data about what their strengths and weaknesses are. And that can be sensitive to changes in a short period of time, like a clinical trial, right, with treatment. So these are just really some challenges that we really need to overcome in terms of our measurements. So when I'm thinking about measurement and my research, these are the sort of barriers that I'm thinking about and how we can either identify, adapt, or develop measures that can do better for us, for getting us ready for clinical trials, right, and doing natural history, but also right now as a clinician, so I can help families like right now. All right, so how do we do this, right? My last slide here. This is partnership, right? And so working with the researchers and clinicians to understand the measurement problems and what's important to measure, working with families about what's important to measure, talking to families. Does this measure seem appropriate for your child or not? Even as a clinician now, oftentimes I have to give measures that aren't quite right? And I talk to families, how is this right or not quite right for your child? Mark it up, mark this page up. Tell me what's not okay about this measure or what's really great about this measure so I can learn from you, right? So partnerships is really important. Then of course, industry, people who are interested in funding, this work, and also regulatory bodies is not on here, but we all need to be working together to really get at this measurement problem so that we can do better in terms of our behavioral phenotyping and get us ready for our natural history studies. So that is pretty much it. Thank you so much for listening. Again, I'm so happy to be here, and I'm going to be here all day, so I would love to talk to you and get to know you all. So thank you again.